I have a challenge for you. I don't want you to use notes on your next speech. You might be thinking, Wade, that's crazy. I've never given a speech before. Of course I need to have notes. But I'm telling you right now, you don't. What we know about reading notes verbatim off of a piece of paper is that it takes away from so many of the fundamentals of what makes a speech great. Things like body language and vocal variety. The best speakers don't use notes, and in this video, I am going to give you 5 specific ways of how you can deliver your next speech with either 0 notes at all or very limited notes that you don't have to reference often during the speech. My first tip for how you can accomplish this is don't write out your full speech word for word. I know this is very tempting, and this is part of many people's process when they begin thinking about creating a speech. They, just like they would write a story, they write out the speech word for word. But the problem with that is it's hard to deviate. It's hard to go away from what we've written down because that initial thing that we've written down is our crutch. We rely on that. And so as we start to practice the speech, when we're practicing and we don't say the words exactly as we've written them down, it can be difficult, and I don't want you to be handcuffed to those original notes. A better way to create your speech is building it into sections. For example, if this YouTube video was a speech, I would have 7 sections. Section number 1 was the intro, the dramatic ripping of the paper that you saw earlier. That would be the first section. Section 2 would be this first tip, don't write out your full speech. The third section would be the second tip, fourth would be the third, and so on, where the 7th section of the speech would be the conclusion. This is a much better way because as you're practicing, you're focusing on ideas or these sections that don't have every word written out verbatim. Another example is with a wedding speech. Again, section 1 will be your introduction, that hook that you use to grab the audience's attention. And then perhaps the second section is a story about the bride or the groom. Here's the great part about telling a story. You don't have to remember all of that, and I'm going to touch on that in an upcoming tip, but it's sections like these. Perhaps the third section would be great characteristics about the bride or groom. The fourth section would be something about the bride or groom's partner that they're about to marry. And then again, the 5th section can be the conclusion. So you break your speech into these different chunks, and it's a much less daunting thing to remember than a bunch of text that's directly on a page. Another important thing to remember that gets some new speakers caught up from time to time is that the audience doesn't know what you've written down. Sometimes we get caught up because we think, oh, as I'm presenting this wasn't exactly like how I had practiced it, but the audience doesn't know that. All they know is what you're delivering to them in that moment. So this is another reason to get away from the word to word so that we don't get caught up on those words that we originally wrote down on a piece of paper. Instead, we have these general themes and we can adapt more easily when we're delivering our speech. My next tip is to memorize your intro and your conclusion of the speech. Those are things you should have well practiced and firm in your mind, because when you stand in front of that audience and you begin to speak, it's a daunting experience. Having all of those eyes on you, feeling the pressure of doing a good job, you want to know what the first words out of your mouth are going to be, and you want to know it very well so that you're not struggling to remember what it was that you were going to say. I mentioned this earlier, but the first things out of your mouth should hook the audience. It should be something more interesting than, "Hi everyone, for those who don't know me, my name is Wade, and I am the best man in this wedding." You don't need to say that. People already know who you are. You don't have to start with that very common introduction. You can jump right into something more entertaining. Perhaps you make the audience laugh and say something humorous right away. Perhaps you jump right into a story. Perhaps you make a bold statement. Perhaps you ask a question. These are all ways to start off the intro of your speech, but that should be something that you have committed to memory. And likewise, you want to know how the speech is going to wrap up, and those final few lines, again, should be memorized. What I like to always advise is that speeches come full circle. So if you started off by asking the audience a question, perhaps in a business presentation, it's a powerful thing to, on the conclusion, revisit that question that you asked, but now with all of the information you gave throughout the speech, you can provide the answer, and that will be a very powerful way to conclude your speech. But the intro and the conclusion should definitely be something you have memorized. The next way you can deliver a presentation without using notes is by sort of cheating the system and using visual notes through a PowerPoint or visual presentation. This is something I do very often because visuals can often add to our speeches, and many presentations, it's common to have some sort of slides. But the secondary benefit of having slides is that those are visual cues or reminders to what you're going to be talking about next. Of course, those slides shouldn't have too many words, and you definitely shouldn't be reading words off of a slide, as that is completely counterproductive to giving a great speech. But if you were going to tell a story about when you were in 5th grade, maybe there's a photo of a playground as you switch to that slide and you remember, elementary school playground, this is my story that I'm telling about 5th grade. That is your cue or your reminder. And if you've built your speech how I suggested earlier, rather than writing out verbatim notes, word for word, you've just built it into sections. Those visuals can represent each of the sections. My pro tip here is to have some sort of visual in front of you. So if you're facing the audience, what I don't want you to do is to continue to look back at your slides that they're looking at, which may be projected behind you, because then you're turning your back to the audience, they won't be able to hear you as clearly, and it doesn't look as professional. Instead, if those slides are connected through an HDMI cord to your laptop, you can have your laptop screen subtly open in front of you. And as you're presenting to the audience, you can quickly look down and you know whatever you're seeing on your laptop will be the same as what's being shown on the projector screen behind you. This is something that's very common for even keynote speakers. They have something called a comfort monitor, which is usually right in front of the stage, which is showing them what slide is being projected. So this is a great way to sort of cheat the whole not having notes, but still be reminded of what you should be talking about. My next tip is to include personal stories. I recently had a guest named Valerie Garcia on my podcast, Keys from Keynotes, and Valerie had this incredible quote, which was, never tell a story without making a point, and never make a point without telling a story. She talked about how it's important to capture the audience's hearts and not just minds when we're trying to get something across. And stories are more interesting. There's a statistic that stories are remembered up to 22 times more than facts alone, but there's a secondary benefit to telling stories while giving a speech, and that is they're easy to remember. If there is a story that you've told family members or friends many times in the past, you don't have to worry about writing that story down word for word. In fact, that would take away from it because this is something you know how to tell. You've already done it. So now your notes can be as subtle as a trigger or a reminder about the story you're supposed to tell, and then you can just jump into the story, whether it's 3 minutes or 5 minutes or 10 minutes. You know how to tell that story, and you know how you're going to tie it into the speech. Stories are one of the best ways that you can avoid having to write down notes. My final tip is something all of you know very well if you've seen my other videos, and that is to practice. And I will say very simply, the difference between people who are so-so speakers and elite speakers is often the commitment to practicing and perfecting that speech. Because you can follow all of the previous 4 tips that I gave you before this one, and I almost guarantee if you never practice that speech and you just show up on the day of the event and you try to deliver it, it will not be as good had you practiced and really focused on how you're going to deliver the speech. Practicing not only gets us more familiar with the material, which is going to be really important if we're not using notes the day of the event, because we're going to be nervous, our minds will be racing, there's going to be enough to worry about. We don't also want to worry about, oh shoot, what was I supposed to say? And the great thing about practice is that keeps it more familiarized in our head. We know that content because we've gone through it a number of times, whether that's by ourselves, whether that's presenting in front of a friend or a family member. We know that material much more solidly, and that is going to help you so much on your quest to deliver a speech without notes. I hope that this video on ditching your notes has been helpful. I really encourage you, if you are somebody who is interested in giving more speeches in the future, try and do this. Try to get away from the crutch that is notes as soon as possible. It is going to be the biggest game changer. It is the single greatest thing that separates amateur speakers from those who are at a bigger, more elite level, is the ability to do a presentation without relying on written notes, especially those people who read the words verbatim like this and their voice sounds so boring. We can do better, my friends. So I encourage you, try to give your next speech without notes. I know you can do it.